Welcome again to another episode of PHS Live. I'm joined by Oscar McCloud and Gene Turner, who were pivotal figures in the United Presbyterian Church and the USA's contribution to the legal defense of Marxist philosopher and activist Angela Davis. I'm going to start very briefly by introducing you to Oscar and to Gene. Oscar is a long-serving Presbyterian administrator and pastor. At the time of the UPCUSA's legal defense, he was staffer of the Council on Church and Race within the UPCUSA. Shortly thereafter, he became director of the program agency. Gene Turner, at the time, was leader of the Synod of the Golden Gate. Welcome to both of you, gentlemen. Thanks for being with us. I'm going to take a moment to just kind of situate us in history for anybody who is not already perfectly aware of everything that went down in 1970 and 71. In 1970, St. Andrew Presbyterian Church in Marin City, California, asked for $10,000 from the UPCUSA Emergency Fund for Legal Aid to support the legal defense of Angela Davis. The Council on Church and Race approved the grant. Gene, who joins us, then working for the Synod, got funds first to the church and from there to Angela Davis's lawyers. The emergency fund for legal aid had gone under several different names. It was created by the General Assembly in 1970 and had assigned $65,000 to be distributed to presbyteries and synods to support, quote from the General Assembly minutes, persons who sought justice when and where it was in short supply. The furor that emerged following the decision to grant money to Angela Davis's legal defense changed the church. National church leaders like the stated clerk, Bill Thompson, and the moderator, Lois Stair, issued official statements in 1970 and 71 assiduously appealing to constitutional values, due process guarantees, equality before the law, but the conservative white church was not receptive. Negative responses came into General Assembly at a rate of 70-1. The 1971 General Assembly called the Council on Church and Race's activity into question, and 1 month later, Gayrod Wilmore and Bryant George got on the phone and called 20 prominent Black Presbyterians. Two of them are on the call today. Each of them contributed $500 to restore the $10,000 to the UPCUSA. The Fund for Legal Aid would continue into the 1980s. Through it, the denomination would help fund bail support and legal defense for marginalized and racialized peoples, carefully adhering to a GA-mandated process where no funds were dispersed without support of a synod or presbytery. And then those recommendations were followed up by legal aid specialists inside the denomination. The fund supported not only Angela Davis, but the legal defense of the American Indian Movement activist Leonard Peltier, the Black Panther 21 of New York City, and the Wilmington 10 of Wilmington, Delaware. In 1988, the fund, which had dispensed as much as $100,000 in 1 year, I think 72, but typically budgeted $50,000, was reduced to $10,000. That is a little historical précis. But the beginning of our story happens in the Bay Area in Marin City. And I hope that, Gene, you can talk us through the beginnings.
The story of Angela Davis, really books could be written about it, but the piece that excites me and excited the committee that made the recommendation to the General Assembly was how this whole request began. The Marin City Presbyterian Church had a practice, liturgical practice, of gathering around the communion table to issue prayer requests for anything in the world. There was a woman in that committee. She happened to be an African-American elder. The church was racially mixed. And she brought the issue of the defense of Angela Davis to the communion table prayer request. And they prayed for Angela, but Angela's presence in the area was prominent. And they prayed, and somehow the prayer led to a consideration of participating in Angela's defense. I don't know the exact thing other than they prayed for her, along with many other issues before the church and the world. And the one that came out that is historically memorable is the request to assist with the defense of Angela Davis. The Marin City Church was a church of, as I said before, it was a multiracial church, but it was not a very wealthy church. It was a church of the lower middle class and probably lower than that. Most of the members of the church lived in the public housing complex in Marin County. Angela Davis is an outstanding citizen. She has a PhD in some discipline in the arts. I don't know precisely what it is, but people liked her. She had a reputation, good reputation in the area. And the committee received a request from the congregation to seek help from the General Assembly for her defense. The committee, along with myself, believed Angela was innocent. Her connection to the event of the judge being killed was because somebody allegedly was in the area of the court looking like Angela Davis. And the person who shot the judge alleged to have had a gun owned by Angela Davis. All of that stuff was wrong. It was just not correct. But the committee gladly submitted the recommendation for funding to the General Assembly, and Oscar's office had a lot to do with the processing of this. He would tell us about that. I essentially drafted the request for the committee, and the committee voted unanimously to make that request. There was no dissent. They were all together. I did some visits to the jail where Angela was held in Marin County to try to talk to her personally. I never got to be in her presence. I talked to her on the phone. One of the things I was trying to do in response to the negative attitude of the church was to get her to write a letter. Now listen to this very carefully. I wanted her to write a letter of thanks. She wouldn't do it. She claimed that the Presbyterian Church did what it did because of its mission, which is true. And So she never wrote the letter. She left, they moved her, correction, they moved her from Marin County Jail to a jail in San Jose, California. And I don't know all the reasons why that happened, frankly. I met with her attorney several times. He was absolutely sure that Angela was innocent, and of course the court proved that she was innocent. We submitted the $10,000 to Angela Davis's treasurer of the defense fund. He came to the committee, and the committee had a wonderful visit with him. He was a very nice guy, African-American. He assistant, a library assistant at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. And I maintained a friendship with him long after the grant had been processed. I don't know what happened to him ultimately, but yeah. Let's see what else I want to. Yeah, one thing I want to say this, but then we can talk about it. After the grant was administered, I received hundreds of letters, probably thousands of letters from various people, most of them Presbyterians, some of them were not. And there were so many letters that I drafted 2 letters for my assistant to select to respond to these people. And she did that amazingly well. And sometimes people will call and request to talk to me. And I decided I could not talk to all the people who wanted to talk to me. I stopped. And the letters went out until people stopped requesting.
Gene, I'm really glad. I don't want to cut you off, but I'm really glad that you mentioned a letter, because one of the things that we have in our possession is a whole host of response letters sent both to the General Assembly and also to the Synod of Golden Gate. And if I can figure out my setup, I'm going to show one on the screen. Okay, so what you should see there is a letter sent to Dr. Illingworth of the Synod.
Yeah.
Yep. Since over 50% of the Presbyterian churches are under the control of the Communist Party, I've decided to look elsewhere for spiritual guidance. And the correspondent continues. I'm convinced that handing $10,000 to the Communist Party had a lot to do with her disenchantment with our church leadership. I'm thoroughly experienced in politics and so on and so on. It is much easier to starve you people out financially and completely rejuvenate our church from top to bottom with American thinking pastors. This fellow goes on, and this may trouble you, Gene, because he actually targets you in the letter. Let's see. Yeah, one thing that we can be sure of is that over 50% of our pastors are morally bankrupt. I strongly urge all of you that are so infatuated with that godless Jewish dictatorship in Russia, go there and experience for yourselves what it is like to live in a godless dictatorship. And he draws up a list of people that he believes are communists. Some of these people I don't know. One is Edler Hawkins, which he misspells elder. Another is Mrs. Ralph Stair, which is Lois Stair, who's the moderator at the time. William P. Thompson, who was stated clerk. And right under there is Eugene Turner. Mr. Aho in the PS says, you can be assured that once I gather all this data, I'm going to hand it to the FBI.
David, I want to speak to why some people perceived Angela Davis to be a communist.
Please do.
She had trouble with racism and declared an exception to the democratic process having to do with race, and declared her, I don't know whether she used the word communism or not, but people assumed she meant it. And they assumed she was a communist. She was simply trying to do that which was right for people and herself. The attorney assured me, and this attorney, I can't name him, he was a famous man from Georgia, Oscar. I don't know whether you remember him or not.
Howard Moore.
That's right. Howard Moore. He had defended many people involved in the civil rights movement in the South. And I don't know how he got to be selected to defend Angela Davis. He assured me, I had 3 conversations with him. He assured me that Angela Davis was innocent, 100% innocent. And I took him at his word because he had a reputation for being a fair, just, honest person. So, but the church didn't stop assailing Angela Davis and us, those of us who tried to defend her. In the end, she was declared innocent of all charges.
And so the public perception following the distribution of this legal aid, as you can see from the kind of response letters that we still have, was the public perception was dramatic.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
And some of the letters we received were from our ecumenical colleagues. I won't try to name them because I might leave somebody out. But it was a real issue from the side of the people who believed that the General Assembly was acting as they stated. But all of that was incorrect. I mean, they had their reasons for drawing those conclusions, but they were not real.
Oscar, this is kind of part and parcel of the experience of working on COCAR in the 60s, right? This is kind of like the summary or maybe the peak of that kind of experience. Can you walk us through your experience starting, I believe in 63, forgive me if I'm wrong.
Well, the Commission on Religion and Race was created by the General Assembly in 1963 for the purpose of focusing and bringing the Presbyterian Church, United Presbyterian Churches, attention to and focus on and participation in the efforts for racial justice. This happened in May, and the March on Washington, led by Dr. King, was in August. And Presbyterians were a significant, quote, presence there. Ironically, the stated clerk at the time, Eugene Carson Blake, was the president of the National Council of Churches. And he was the only white Protestant clergy to participate and to speak during that March on Washington. He expressed or created the phrase that became well known and repeated, speaking for the churches, late we come, but we come. And that was an accurate statement because the churches had virtually ignored the participation and presence of the effort in the civil rights movement. And that began sort of the spiraling of the effort of numerous Presbyterians going south to participate in the marches. A few Presbyterians, one in particular in Ohio, whose name I do not remember, gave his life because he was crushed by an earth mover there. But for a number of the synods, they began to develop their own justice program. And Eugene the Pacific, Senate of the Pacific represented part of that. The Senate of Pennsylvania had a strong presence. Even the Senate of Florida under the UPC church had a presence. That continued when the marches were taking place. This is a personal thing, but I'll share it with you. A person who's well known to people my age and younger in the Presbyterian Church, Dean Lewis, he went to Birmingham following the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, picked up some of the broken pieces of glass, and on some special occasion in my life, he presented me the framed broken pieces of the glass, quoting an Old Testament, but Rahab weeps for her children. I mention that because it's a good transition to the question of Angela Davis. A lot of people were unaware that Angela Davis was a peer of the 4 girls who were killed in that bombing on that Sunday. And she grew up, her early life was in Birmingham, Alabama. So people who were indifferent to what was happening to the persons who were advocating for justice, and to people who were totally innocent, like those 4 girls, totally ignore or ignorant of how that may have affected Angela Davis. Jean dealt with the initiative or the initiation of the request. I happened to have been the administrator at the Council on Church and Race, and we followed the procedure. There had to be a validated request from the judicatory, and that was the Senate of the Pacific. That had to be a validated request, to which the guidelines didn't require a vote by the council. It was possible for the staff to implement that, and that's what happened. The check was drawn and sent to the Senate of the Pacific. Interestingly enough, the staff of the council that discussed this was surprised by the reaction to the grant for the Legal Defense Fund. It was not a grant to Angela Davis, as some people have alluded to. It was a grant for her legal defense, and as Jean has indicated, it went to that Legal Defense Fund. The reason we were so surprised is that this was not enabling her to avoid the judicial process. It was enabling her, hopefully, to get a better chance. The fact that she was Black, a female, and also a Marxist or Marxist tendencies was 3 strikes against her. And that's what led us to believe and agree with the Senate in the request that she was not going to be able to raise money from the Communist Party, as some of those protesters and letters stated. One of the other things that surprised us is we expected there'd be more of a reaction against the $25,000 bail bond grant to the Presbyterian of New York to assist in getting Black Panthers bailed out of New York City jail.
Yeah.
To my knowledge, there wasn't a single letter protesting that, and maybe it was overshadowed, obviously, by the support for Angela Davis's defense. But one of the things I recall at the time was the fact that Richard Nixon had referred to Angela Davis as the most notorious criminal, something to that effect, in the history of the United States. This was when she was, quote, in flight and had suspected had come to New York. One of the other things is that has always intrigued me, even before I got involved in the staffing in the denomination, is Americans' reaction to communism compared to Americans' reaction to segregation and discrimination. I didn't even know what communism was when protesting in front of a Woolworth on Broadway, down the street from Columbia University and Union Seminary. I was called a no good communist. And I really didn't know what a communist was. I had to go and look it up. I had heard the word, but it did not interest me. One of the other things that happened after this uproar in the denomination was this group of 20 Black Presbyterians who contributed $500. And it's interesting. Can you put that?
I can put it up. Yep.
Okay, because I want to call the participants' attention to a couple of statements in that letter, that statement.
One moment, please. The other one.
No, that's the one. That's the
I
letter.
know.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Okay. If you move down to the second paragraph,
It is important for everyone to understand.
it is important for everyone to understand that we are not reimbursing the church out of mere, I don't know what that is, that's covered with.
Sorry, my screen is.
Okay, of
Obnoxious.
anxiety
There you
about the alarm in the, we are not reimbursing the church to quieten those who disagree with the Council on Church and Race for making the grant in the first place. We are not reimbursing the church in a way of releasing it from its clear responsibility. I want to focus on that and call attention to that, because sometimes I think it may have been a mistake for the group of 20 Black Presbyterian to have made this gift or grant because of the way in which the denomination misinterpreted and misused the gift by the 20 Black Presbyterians. They didn't use it as a way of affirming what the denomination had done. They used it as a means of saying, well, look, they've returned the money. We couldn't return the money because we didn't have the money. But that's what I mean by interpretation. I would urge people to read this statement and to study. It ought to be studied by every Presbyterian in order to seek to understand the issue of racial justice in the denomination at that particular time. Gene Turner and I are probably the only two of the 20 plus Presbyterian signers of that who are still alive. PHS has done an excellent job of assembling material from several sources on the grant for the defense of Angela Davis. It's important to recall a couple of things that happened along the way. There's one thing that I'm not clear about, David. In one of the notes from PHF, it says, it notes that the General Assembly validated the action by the council in 1970 at the Rochester Assembly. I think it was the 1971 in Rochester. Anyway, that's my note. But it says Presbyterian leader Gayrod Wilmore was ushered out of national agency work. I have no knowledge of such an action, and maybe that's what Gay Wilmore said, and maybe that's what he felt. I don't know the source of that, but it did trouble me when I read it. One of the other things that was very clear at the time, pardon me, after the General Assembly's meeting, when it did not invalidate what the council had done. It simply questioned, I think there were, they used the word beginning with P that I don't remember, but it was the way of saying, we don't like what you did, but we're not going to reject what you did. Something, it sort of parallel that. There was a gathering of staff in 475 Riverside Drive at the request of the moderator, who was Lois Stair. And that meeting involved, you can remove that from the screen now,
Sure.
David. That meeting involved several national staff, including Ken Nye, General Secretary of the Board of National Missions, Gerard Wilmore, Bryant George, who was an administrator in the Board of National Missions, and I was present. There probably was others who were present also. Lois Stair repeatedly called for the firing of some staff person or persons. And at that point, Gay Wilmore offered to leave the meeting. And I'll always remember this, and he rose in my esteem. Nye was about 5'6", turned red in the face, and rose about 10 feet in stature, and stated that no one's going to be fired unless it was he. And he said, I'm not going anyplace. And that ended that discussion. But that, for me, that was Lois Stair's contribution to what was going on in the debate in the denomination.
Oscar, just to confirm, that's Lois Stair as moderator of the assembly in
That's right.
7071 demanded that staff from Korar Kokar be fired.
That's right. I'm a personal witness to that because I was sitting there. I heard it. It was in the meeting.
Yep.
I also heard Ken Nye's response to her.
Yep.
To that request.
One
That-
thing,
Let me just say one other thing, Gene, and then we can change. I think the grant for the defense of Angela Davis has, on the one hand, brought out the best, and on the other hand, the worst in the Presbyterian Church. And I'll only illustrate that, and as you say in one of your notes, David, someplace, the mere mention of Angela Davis's name, I've been amazed at how, I mean, that is grind into people's minds. They used to talk that way about Red China in the 1950s. China is a communist country, but you don't hear them talking about China as a communist country. Maybe it's because we are too dependent upon what China provides. But I was speaking to a group in Texas. I was using a manuscript. And when I finished speaking, and there was a period of time for a question, one guy wanted to know, why did I mention Angela Davis in my presentation? I was shocked. And I asked the audience if anybody else heard me mention Angela Davis. And virtually nobody did. No one else other than this man. And I think what happened is that Gene Turner, for some on the West Coast, but more so Oscar McCloud at 475 Riverside Drive, the mere name conjured up Angela Davis. And I think that's what was happening in this particular issue. Now, Gene.
You were just so strongly identified.
I'm so strongly identified.
Go ahead, Gene.
one
And I
thing,
never met the woman, the lady.
one thing I did not say that is relevant here is one of the reasons Angela was arrested. The governor at the time of California was President Reagan. He became president. At the time he was governor, he ordered her arrest. Now I can't fathom what some of the stuff that resulted in what Oscar has described. I mean, it has to do with a blind sort of racism, but also political, a blind political view of a thing called communism. But we weren't defending a communist. We were defending a person who had been ill-treated through the justice system. And we did the right thing, a noble thing. And I think eventually some Presbyterians understood the nobility of what we had done as Presbyterians, but it took all of this suffering to get there.
Yeah.
David, let me just illustrate Gene's point. Following the assembly, the debate raged on, and on a 60-minute segment featuring Ernie Campbell, Presbyterian, pastor of Riverside Church, and William Hutnut, pastor of Second Presbyterian Church, Indianapolis, later to become mayor of Indianapolis. They were debating the grant to Angela Davis's defense. William Hutnut was taking the position that it was wrong because she was a communist. Ernie Campbell was taking the position of the biblical call to justice, especially on the oppressed, the marginalized. And at one point he said, and I remember this so vividly, he said, Bill, the darker you paint Angela Davis, the more you justify the validity of the grant.
Yeah.
It's ironic that the country has had a kind of illness about communism. But to show you the hypocrisy about that, we deal with China, greatly in debt to China. We purchase seafood from Vietnam, but we carry on like a 5-year-old about Cuba and communism in Cuba. We really are not opposed to communism. We simply don't like the fact that this little country, this little island, this handful of people slapped us in the face.
I wonder if either or both of you can continue to reflect on this event as part of a series of events, right? There's a long history of bail support and legal support for activists and other people who are unlikely to receive a fair trial. That more or less begins with Angela Davis, but it continues into the 1980s. And the whole church was experiencing dramatic change through the 60s. And I'm glad, Oscar, that you began with 1963, because the activism of the kind of beginning in 1963 culminates in the passage of the Confession of 67, where the church says to itself, all Christians are called to reconcile with one another, to eliminate crushing poverty, to seek peace, even at the cost of national security. And C67 is like a mainstream statement in 1967. By 1971, from my perspective, reading the records, it seems like there's a high watermark, and the church, which came so far so fast from 63 to 67, begins arguably to retrench. Do either or both of you have thoughts about what followed 71 in those terms?
Well, C67 is an excellent theological document. I think it's almost perfect. But the issue of Angela Davis, the response was more race and politics. And the people who were opposing the grant to her defense were not rational, frankly. They were listening to some powerful secular people, the governor of California, other politicians who were going after Dr. Davis. It became irrational. Now, race was an issue, no question about that. But in the case of the grant that we made to her defense, it was beyond race. It was race and. Somebody created the image of her, of Angela, being outside of the courtroom. Angela had a beautiful natural head of hair. And someone somehow put her outside of that courtroom and claimed that she had provided the gun that a Black person decided to shoot the judge. And there was no correcting of that. And the attorney who was defending her said, I assure you that there is no way that Angela can be convicted because she is 100% innocent. And he managed to pull that off.
Yeah. Part of the concern on behalf of Davis's lawyers was that she was such a prominent and public figure.
She was.
It was impossible to get a fair trial in Marin City and Marin County.
And given the fact that Nixon, when she was a fugitive from justice, had referred to her as one of, if not the most notorious criminals. The question that you asked a moment ago, David, about change, and there are a couple of things that come to mind. I'd say that the denomination has never had as one of its primary programmatic objectives the struggle against racism. And I say this because it has never put the resources behind such. And there's a kind of ambivalence, has been, still is, but there was a kind of ambivalence in the United Presbyterian Church. When Jean Blake said, late we come, but we come, there's a part truth in that, but there's some that's not true. They created a commission on church and race, but they gave it like $200,000 to combat racism on behalf of the Presbyterian Church. Okay. Now, what happened is that there were some leaders who were committed to battling racial justice. And I mentioned Ken Nye's name earlier, and I want to tell you another example of something that happened in the same period of time when the Black Manifesto had come and the church offices in New York City had been invaded, or however you want to put that. One of the responses of the denomination, when James Foreman spoke to the San Antonio Assembly, I think in 1969, one of the responses of the assembly, and they were asking for $500,000, 500,000, something like that, $500,000. It wasn't 500 million, but maybe it was. It should have been, they should not have had a number on it. But anyway, the response of the Presbyterian Church between 1969 and 1970, 72, 71 was to create two programs. It did not contribute to the Black United Fund, which is what the manifesto called for, but it set up the self-development of people. But again, it did not provide any funding for it. It said it would be funded out of a special offering. And Ken Nye and John Coventry Smith took the microphone, went to the microphone at that assembly in Chicago, and both pledged to seek to get their respective agencies to contribute $600,000 each in order to get that self-development program going. Now, some people were stunned by that, and some others applauded. And they probably gave him a standing ovation. But I'll tell you what happened in the ensuing years as a result of that. The United Presbyterian Church was in the midst of a massive reorganization, restructuring of the General Assembly agencies. They removed the possibility of that ever happening again by putting all of the corporations into the.
You're muted, Oscar.
So when the program agency came into existence, it was not a legal structure. It was a programmatic entity. It had no authority over the reserves.
So what you're saying is that when the Board of National Missions and the Commission on Ecumenical Mission and Relations, COMAR, both their heads got together and put forward 600 grand each to deliver to SDOP. Following that, in the 1972 restructure, there's a separation between the people who control money and the staff who do programs. That's what you're saying?
That's right. And that was probably the biggest, largest policy shift in the past 50 years. And that has continued. There is no entity in the General Assembly today of the PCUS that has, quote, the freedom that the Council on Church and Race had in the 1960s, 1970s.
Well, that says something about the current, current understanding of the struggle of racism within the Presbyterian Church, but all of Christendom in the US. And it's an issue that's not going away, apparently. It's just not.
To that point, Gene, I hope that one of the things that the statement of 20 Black Presbyterians mentions is that this is not to discharge the church of its responsibilities with regard to ending racism and all forms of oppression. We are not reimbursing the church as a way of releasing it from its clear responsibility. The idea of responsibility is that it's ongoing, that it's something that just can't be discharged. I wonder if either of both of you would speak to what your sense is of the continuing responsibility of Presbyterians to enact the promises that they made in the 60s and 70s.
Oscar and I met with a group formed by the General Assembly. I can't name, I guess it was the last assembly, I'm not sure. Dealing with racism. We were impressed with the group of people on the special committee. But it's very clear that churches, though claim the love of Jesus Christ for all people, churches have not yet digested that understanding. We are still struggling with unfairness, injustice within the church and outside. You would think the churches would be the strongest advocate for justice. That's not the case. There are some evidence of advocacy going back to the time when Oscar was at the General Assembly. But it's still an issue. It's still an issue.
Well, building on what Gene has just said, I think part of the problem is that we fail to recognize and accept that the Christian church, specifically the Presbyterian church, is much more a reflector of culture, of the culture and of society than it is of the Christian gospel. Jean Blake's words ring again. Late we come, but we come. The church has never been leading on any kind of social justice issue, whether it was the suffrage for women, ordination of women, justice for LGBTQ people. Church hasn't been the leader. The church is more often has been the blocker. At one time, the church said, if you as a Presbyterian minister perform a same-sex marriage, you're subject to be disciplined. It took the federal government to quote, I think with the help of the courts, to legalize same-sex marriage. So we verbalize the essence of the gospel. We do it now even with this Matthew 25. How much of the resources of the church, the denomination, have actually been, quote, redirected and placed behind Matthew 25?
Well, that's a good question. Theologically, we have an answer, but practically,
Gene, this is where you and I differ. I don't want a theological answer. I want a practical answer and practical results that affect people's lives.
well, I share that. I share that.
Good.
I do hold a strong faith that the issue will be addressed and adjusted, but maybe that's just my faith. I don't, it's been going on for centuries, so I don't know. I just don't know.
It is a struggle that's been ongoing for centuries. And one of the things that has come back into prominence in the last year has been the struggle against the police industrial complex and the carceral nature of our society. Going back to Oscar, what you mentioned about Ken Nye and allocating $200,000 to COCAR to start, it's transparent that ending racism is more than a $200,000 problem.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think now is probably a good time to let everybody know that we do have space for questions and answers. For anybody who's tuned into the webinar, some of you have discovered the Q&A function already in the webinar, but I'd be happy to read out questions that come in through the Q&A function. So that's going to be at the bottom bar of your screen. We also have questions on coming in through the comments on Facebook. So
David, I think you might be the one to decide what we respond to.
I'm looking for questions.
Okay.
Yep. One interesting thing that got mentioned in the Q&A already, there's someone who has said the C-67 does not suggest the church should act against national security. Depends. I think it's worth taking a closer reading of the Confession of 67. One of the obstacles to passage of Confession of 67 at the Portland Assembly was the passage on peacemaking. And the confession actually says that that Christians are called to pursue the path of peace even at the risk of national security. And what happened at the General Assembly was the Presbytery of National Capital, which is DC, which included among its number DC luminaries like the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara. The DC Presbyterian objected to that language on the floor of the assembly, and the whole text of the confession was sent back to the committee that drafted it. The committee worked all night into the morning and took a vote at midnight of the day they were working and ruled 13-12 to proceed with the prior language and not change it. We were one vote away from creating a peacemaking statement with a gigantic gaping hole in the middle of it. A peacemaking statement that would have said, actually, developing nuclear weapons capable of annihilating all life on Earth is perfectly fine. Presbyterians were one vote away from doing that. It's a very interesting period in the church's history. We've got a couple of more questions that have come in. I hope, possibly. I have a question that maybe one or both of you can answer about Edler Hawkins and his support for the grant and his kind of public relations role following it.
What, say that again, David?
I'm sorry, there's a question about the role that former moderator Edler G. Hawkins played in the aftermath of the grant.
Hawkins?
Well,
Yes.
I think Edler Hawkins had played a crucial role going back to the 1963 assembly. I was not there, but I am told that it was Edler Hawkins' speech that turned the assembly to the point of adopting or creating the Commission on Religion and Race. Edler Hawkins had been burned by fire. The first time he was put up as a candidate for moderator, the opposition from him played the old political trick of digging up whatever they could find, and they found where Edler Hawkins had attended a cell meeting in Harlem of what somebody identified as communist. So they, at that point, accused him of being a communist. Edler Hawkins, for me, was epitomized by what happened at the 1963 assembly. Here was a Black clergy from New York City running for moderator. At the same time, a white pastor from Covenant Church, Peachtree, Atlanta, was seeking that position. Edler Hawkins lost by one vote because Edler Hawkins voted for Herman, I don't remember his last name.
Herman Morse?
No, it wasn't Herman Morse, but he was the pastor. And so the next year, Edler Hawkins was nominated again by New York City Presbyterian for the assembly in 1964, Oklahoma City, and he won. And Edler Hawkins was an advocate consistently in prodding the Presbyterian Church, the United Presbyterian Church, to do what it knew was right. It created the Presbyterian Economic Development Committee or Council. I don't know what the last word was.
Corporation, right?
Corporation.
Petco was a corporation.
So there's no question there was never before in my lifetime, and there hasn't been anybody since who reached the stature in terms of the prophetic nature and of their advocacy compared to Edna Hawkins. David, there's a participant out of my long, almost forgotten past named Mike Josannes, who was a commissioner at the assembly of the Angela Davis debate and would like to make a comment about his experience.
If that's okay with both of y'all, I can make that happen for Mike.
That's fine with me, and you can block me out if that's necessary to do
No,
that.
we're good. Mike, I'm going to give you the floor if you're available.
Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Got it? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yep.
Welcome.
All right. I'm honored to be in the presence of these two giants who I came out of Texas and came to New Jersey as a pastor and met Brian George and everything from that first meeting and drinking his martinis got me to where I was. So go to the General Assembly. The General Assembly, I was a commissioner from Palisades Presbyterian and ready to go to make a big speech in favor of the Angela Davis grant. And so we would talk, and I remember I was poised at a microphone. I can't remember who our whip was, but I was there ready to go. And finally, I got to the point where they called on me, and I saw the whip do this, no more. So all I could say was, I believe we had a female moderator. I got after the word, Mademoiselle Moderator. I'm Mike Josannes, Presbyterian of the Palisades. I moved the previous question. I did it, cut off debate, and we won. So just quickly, I go back to my seat, and we were near the back of the auditorium, and there's a young woman, young woman with a pad and pencil. Could I interview you? I said, well, this is a high school newspaper or maybe a college newspaper. I talked to her, and I spilled out all that speech that I was going to make. Good, I felt good. Next morning, I'm greeted by one of my fellow commissioners as he slammed down in front of me the newspaper, the front page of the largest newspaper in Rochester. And there is Mike Josannes quoted all that side. So I said, oh, okay, that's all right. Then he also said, you know what? I'm sending a copy back to Leonia, New Jersey, to your clerk of session. So you better start finding other employment. Got back home, and this is the story about the end. Back home, and I sat down with the clerk of session, and he said, well, there's one guy who's out to get you. He said, you better go talk to him. I said, okay, I'll do it. So I went and spent about an hour and a half with this guy. He never moved. And we had a special meeting of the session where they were to consider my continuing employment. And they just said, who is I? I'm not going to tell you. They said, we got to know who this guy is. And I gave him his name. And my clerk of session said, you know what? That guy quit the Lions Club. Let's get rid of him. We want you to stay, Mike. One of the great moments of my life. And I still to this day, but I'm crying over all this, knowing that where we are now had those marvelous roots. But these two giants here and all the ones who are no longer with us. And that still remains. You know, I don't know if we're ever going to get it all together as long as we're around. But man, I'm going to keep trying, and I'm glad to see the two of you are too. Thank you very much.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Mike.
Mike.
Thank you for your testimony, Mike. We have a couple more questions in the chat that I would love to get to. One comes from someone who has asked, and this is probably an Oscar question. Someone asked about the generational divide in COCAR. Was there a difference between people who had come up in the freedom movement of the 50s and 60s and the people who were trying to do the same work under, in the Reagan years, under very different circumstances?
I don't think so. I was part of the younger generation. Gay Wilmore and Metz Rollins were part of in staff-wise, part of another generation. But the council elected membership was made up of an interesting diversity of people. And I think they worked toward a common purpose, a common goal. So I don't think there was any kind of generational divide there.
Do you think there were different approaches?
Well, there would be different approaches. I mean, the lawyers like Bill Thompson and Roy Romer of Colorado, who was became governor after that. By the way, I got a call from somebody when he was running for governor wanting to know what was his role in the Angela Davis affair. People like that. And then there was the professor from San Francisco Seminary, delightful guy whom I can't remember, who brought a different kind of perspective. But no, in the end, and we had two marvelous people as co-moderators. Bryant George was a genius at I can say this now that he's resting in peace, but he was a genius at maneuvering and manipulating. Edla Hawkins was one of the chairpersons, and a banker from Scarsdale, New York, Henry Neal, was the other. And you could look at Henry Neal and tell that Henry Neal was a conservative not pinstripe, black suit guy with a pocket watch and his chain across his chest. But they were a marvelous team that actually led the council, both in terms of elected membership and staff.
We have another question in the Q&A, and this is available for both of you. Reunion of the UPCUSA and the Southern Stream PCUS in 1983 impacted every aspect of the church. Do you think that there was an impact that reunion had on the anti-racism work of the denomination?
Well, there were several church bodies opposed reunion. Even in the area that I was working, there were some Presbyterians who opposed it. However, ecumenically speaking and historically speaking, we never ever should have been separated. And this was an opportunity, I thought, to bear witness to our unity. And it happened. I don't think it hurt. We still have racism. We had it then and in different forms. But I can't say anything negative about that. It was good.
I'm reading down, trying to find the question again, David. Can you repeat it?
Say again?
No, I'm asking David if he can repeat the question I was reading from the chat box.
It's a little bit disorganized, but the basic gist was how did reunion affect anti-racism work in the church? Oscar, I think you're muted.
I did in order to drown out some noise. Last time, David, repeat your question.
We've been asked what effect reunion had on anti-racism work in the church.
I guess I know now.
Is that too big?
I guess I know now why I didn't hear the question twice. I think we have regressed. I think we have regressed. This is a non-researched opinion or perspective. For liberals in the Presbyterian Church US, They welcomed reunion because it meant that they were part of a larger, quote, fellowship of similar minds. The conservatives in the United Presbyterian Church welcomed reunion because it added to their force. And I think that's been one of the problems. I mean, one of the problems that I have with reunion in retrospect is that I have yet, well, I shouldn't say I've yet to see, I'm not going to see it. There was never a transparent statement made by the reuniting General Assembly confessing the sin of separation and confessing why they separated in the first place. It was the only, quote, historically, I don't like the word mainline, historically white Protestant denomination, excluding of the Southern Baptists, that did not reunite shortly after the war was over. So I don't think, maybe reunion enhanced the image of unity and ecumenicity, maybe, but it did not further the cause of racial justice. Illustration. At the time of reunion, the two denominations, one denomination had twice as many members as the other, but when they created the national agencies, they were made up of equal numbers from the two denominations. That created something of the tone and atmosphere of what began to happen. And the policy change, or what continued, I shouldn't say began, but the policy changes and the restriction and the lack of freedom of initiative that had existed in the United Presbyterian Church disappeared, and around racial justice.
I don't differ with what Oscar said. I think it's a reality. I respect the decision because of the history it tried to address and the ecumenical understanding of church life. But I can't differ with what you said. There are a lot of mistakes made. But to me, moving forward together was a major symbol. And yet I have criticisms.
I have another question from the Q&A from, I think, somebody you guys know, Manly Olson, who's known to me as well. Manly's question is, from 1978 until 2011, ordination and marriage, the struggle for equality in ordination and marriage were in the forefront of PCUSA politics. Did that energy have a major impact in the reduction of emphasis on racial justice?
I don't quite get that question. Oscar, go if you got it. I didn't get it.
Well, if you're committed, this is my view. If you're committed to justice, you're committed to justice on all fronts. Wilmore struggled with this with the Council on Church and Race, because although it grew out of the civil rights movement, he pulled into that effort the Latino and the Native American. Cecil Caldwell, what's Cecil's last name?
Cecil Corbett.
Cecil Corbett.
Mr. Native America.
Native American, and Roger Granados were brought on as adjunct staff to symbolize the fact that it wasn't just about justice for Black people, African-American people. And so I find it difficult if the denomination is really committed and believes in justice, it applies to all groups who have been denied, who've been oppressed, excluded, and it applies to all causes. I think that's my response.
That none of us is free until every one of us is free.
That is right.
I think there's a good jumping off point in the chat for Jean and Oscar. What do you think the lessons are from, what are the lessons the church of the 2020s can take from this experience in the 1970s?
But that's an excellent question. I met with a group in my congregation last night. How to be the church in the 2020s is a real challenge. One reason is that the millennials, that's what they refer to as millennials, they're not craving religion. And we don't know quite why. Are they looking at our imperfections? Are they just decided that they don't want to be religious? That's a hurdle to overcome. That's very, very difficult. Now, the church is very imperfect. I wish we were more consistent with the gospel and our documents of faith. But I don't know why the millennials are not coming to church. You know, Europe has had this problem longer than we have had it. They've been walking away from the church. But now we have it. And this congregational committee with whom I met last night talked about that. And they had some good suggestions. I won't try to repeat them because I don't remember them all. But we are in a very difficult time. The church is not a perfect instrument. Are people walking away because of our imperfection? I don't think that's all. I don't think that's all of it, because we've been imperfect all along. I don't know what it is.
Well, I have to apologize, David. I've been reading the chats.
I can ad lib a little. I'm just going to select. I'm only selecting a couple of questions, and I would avoid reading everything in the chats.
Okay.
We're living at a moment where, again, we have a renascent Black Lives Matter movement in this country. You know, the first efflorescence is in 2015, following the extrajudicial murder of Michael Brown in St. Louis. And last year was another efflorescence. And so the movements surrounding racial justice and the freedom movement of the 60s and 70s is finding a new kind of echo in this decade. So it seems reasonable to ask people from 50 years ago for advice about simply what to do. I mean, Oscar, what would your advice be to a young Presbyterian looking at the Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, the first is an observation. I know that people have generally identified the Black Lives Matter movement as synonymous with the protests. I think the protests were larger than the Black Lives Matter. But that's not taking anything away from Black Lives Matter, because I want to affirm the fact that the protests of 2019 and 2020, those protests have accomplished things that the civil rights movement did not accomplish. The civil rights movement removed the label, white only, colored only, whatever. There was no talk, substantive talk, or movement on the part of corporate America to change the way in which it does business during the civil rights movement. The fact that the protests have resulted in major corporations developing diversity programs. Now, putting an African American or Hispanic American or Native American or whatever in a position in and by itself, I can attest to the fact that is not necessarily going to change for the masses, because you have now an African American in mission agency, you have an African American stated clerk, and what are they talking about again in the mission agency now is restructuring. See, restructuring has multiple initiatives behind it. If I were voting for restructuring, I'd say go back to the pre-1972 structure, when you had a Board of National Missions, a Board of Christian Education, and a Commission on Ecumenical Mission Relations. Those particular terms may not be appropriate for today, but my advice would be keep the pressure on, to paraphrase Jesse Jackson, keep hope alive, because as a people of faith, we do have to maintain hope. If we lose our hope, then we've lost. And the third thing I would say, if I were being asked, is apply the pressure where you are. Only so much can be done, so to speak, from the top down. Illustration. The more the General Assembly agencies change, the more the income is reduced. And the income comes from the congregations. So we got to have change of attitude and behavior at that level. And by all means, if you want to change this, a culture of this body called the United Presbyterian Church, or the Presbyterian Church USA, I'm sorry, PCUSA, you've got to be part of it. You got to be an identifiable part of it. Otherwise, it really doesn't have to listen to what you have to say. That's my response.
Thank you for that, Oscar. Gene, do you have any advice for young Presbyterians seeing the country change around them?
Well, I hope, it's a hope, and I guess my advice is to keep pressure on, that's Oscar's phrase, for justice, liberation, faith, commitment, and not denying the imperfectness of the practice of that. And I don't, now, as I said before, I don't know why the millennials are walking away from the church. I see the faults. They are bright, and they probably see them too, but I don't know. And I do think that's what this committee from my congregation was talking about last night. I do think that we have to find ways to reach out to all people respecting their different cultures. One of the questions that group mentioned last night was, can we get people from the city to come to suburban Presbyterian churches? I don't think so. I don't know. That's why I don't want to claim something I know I don't know. I don't know. It's a good question.
Yeah. Well, this has been a fascinating and a wide-ranging conversation. I didn't expect that we would begin to talk about national agency structures and the theological bases of peacemaking, but we have. I would like to thank both of you for joining us and for being the kind of people that we hear about so much in this denomination. People who stand for justice will not rest.
David,
Yes, sir.
there is an element of confusion, and maybe Gene and I created it, that needs to be answered either by you offline or online about the grant. I mean, the $10,000 from the 20 individuals, and about, where's the other one? There's another one which apparently we were not quite clear about the process that moved from the request from California to the action of the council.
If you want to talk about the process and how it was followed, we can do that.
I will do it very quickly.
Yes, sir.
The request came from the Synod of Pacific on behalf of the community and with the request for funds for the defense of Angela Davis. It came to the council. According to the guidelines at the time, once the request was validated by the judicatory, all that was necessary for the Council on Church and Race was an administrative decision based upon, are the funds available and has the process been followed? And if that's the case, grant the money. It did not require a vote by the council elected membership. That probably changed subsequently, but that was the process.
And I've already stated that the local committee was unanimous in its request.
Thank you both. It's a reminder that the things that movements leave behind are structures and processes, and that a movement is not going to prosper without something that can sustain itself over time. Like you talked about earlier yesterday, the process will persist even absent the personalities. Gentlemen, I'd like to thank you so much for your time. I've learned a lot and I continue to learn a lot. I'd like to thank everybody who joined us here and on Facebook Live. Thank you for being part of the conversation. And visit our website for more information about the Angela Davis Legal Defense Fund, about the Emergency Fund for Legal Aid, which has its own fascinating history. And for more information about the church's response 50 years ago to the Black Manifesto promulgated by Jim Foreman. Gene, Oscar, thank you so much.
Thank you, David, for arranging this.
It's my pleasure. Gene, thanks everybody. We are at an end.
Thanks.